tranquil evening in the kitchen destroyed the frail bonds between us, changing everything in an instant. The only sounds were the constant hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock as I stood at the counter, absent-mindedly stirring my coffee and watching the sky darken. It had been a long time since I'd shared a house with anyone, and I had no idea how much his presence would alter things when my nephew moved in. He had arrived last week, following some problems at home. It was just supposed to be temporary till he straightened things out, as he put it. His words ambiguous and avoiding any more explanation. I did not press him. I knew life might be complex at his age, with more questions than answers, and I assumed he needed room to figure things out for himself. Just when I was buried in thinking, a quiet creak of footfall reverberated down the corridor. He emerged in the doorway, lingering for a while, as if he hadn't expected to see me there. His gaze met mine, and he flashed that old wicked grin. I had seen him 100 times before when he was a youngster, but he was no longer a kid. He appeared taller, more rounded out, more mature, something I hadn't seen previously, yet there was still that spark of boyishness about him. "Hey, uncle," he greeted with a gentle, hesitant voice. "Hey, you," I said, indicating to the chair across from me at the kitchen table. I couldn't sleep, so I inquired. He shook his head, and a shadow appeared on his face, which he tried to wipe off with a grin. "Guess not," he grumbled as he settled into the chair and rested his arms on the table. "I've been thinking about it a lot." I think I nodded, trying not to pry too much. It might be beneficial to discuss the situation. He didn't respond right away, his attention locked on his hands, while he fidgeted with a stray thread on his sleeve. He appeared to be poised to open up for a minute, before averting his gaze and shrugged. "It's just stuff, you know." "Yeah, I get it," I said, offering a small smile, "but don't keep it bottled up whenever you're ready to talk. I'm here." We lapsed into a comfortable silence, each lost in our own thoughts. The only sound between us, the ticking clock. There was something oddly peaceful about it, though it felt like there was something unspoken hanging in the air. I could sense his tension, that invisible barrier. He appeared hesitant to break through, but I wasn't going to push him. After a few minutes, he spoke out, just above a whisper. "Do you ever have instances when you're not sure where you are? You don't really know where you're heading?" I gazed at him, examining his expression. He didn't ask casually. His statements carried a gravity and vulnerability that threw me off guard. "Yeah, I've had my fair share of those situations," I responded, picking my words carefully. "It's natural, especially if you're young. Sometimes you simply have to take things day by day until they start to make sense." He offered a slight nod, but his gaze remained far away, immersed in whatever thoughts were racing through his head. I couldn't tell if my remarks had helped or if he was simply putting on a brave face. Either way, I realized it wasn't a good moment to press him for answers. Then, as if sensing the need to lighten the atmosphere, he shifted the conversation, inquiring about a previous fishing trip we had taken years ago. I chuckled, reminiscing about the day he'd fallen into the lake, drenched and laughing despite the cold. He laughed too, the sound breaking the tension between us, and for a brief moment, it felt like old times again. like nothing had changed. But as the laughter faded, the silence returned heavier than before. I could see he had something to say, but was having difficulty expressing it. He looked at me, his eyes looking to see whether I understood. Before I could question, he jumped up quickly, his chair scraping across the floor. "Thank you for the conversation, Uncle," he added. "I think I'll go to bed." With a tiny grin on his lips and a nod of approval, I responded. I watched as he moved out of the kitchen, his footsteps disappearing down the hallway. His comments had an air of finality to them, as well as a lingering uncertainty that made me question what was going through his head. I knew he was holding back, but I couldn't force him to open up. The house was silent again, with the faint noises of the night drifting in through the open windows. I finished my coffee, lost in thought, replaying our conversation in my mind. There was more to his story, more than he was letting on. And though I respected his need for privacy, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. But the story didn't end there. The days that followed flowed together in a weird cadence. He was quiet, generally keeping to himself, but there were times when he'd emerge in the kitchen or living room, as if he wanted to say something, but stopped himself at the last minute. So I let him figure it out. He'd arrive when he was ready. One evening, as I was settling in with a book, he came into the living room, his eyes filled with doubt. He shifted his weight and looked about the room, as if seeking for the proper words. Eventually, he spoke. "Uncle, have you ever regret something you didn't say or do?" I laid down my book and met his gaze. "Sure, everyone has regrets, but I try not to think about them too often. It's easy to get caught up in the past. But at the end of the day, you should concentrate on what you can control." He nodded, but his look remained confused, as if he was battling with something deeper, even if just sometimes. I'm curious what might have happened if I'd made other decisions. I wasn't sure what he was saying, but I could sense he was struggling with something. Whatever it is, don't let it consume you within. Regret may be a big load, but you do not have to bear it alone. He offered me a little smile, raising the corners of his mouth. "Thank you, Uncle. That really helps." For the first time since his arrival, he appeared truly relieved, as if a weight had been lifted off his shoulders. He stayed a bit longer, speaking about trivial stuff, and I felt a sense of intimacy return, like the link we had when he was younger. However, it appeared like everything were returning to normal. I couldn't shake the notion that there was still something unsaid, something lurking under the surface. I wasn't sure what it was, but I knew it was only a matter of time until he was ready to fully open up. As the night progressed, and I saw him depart the room, I felt a peculiar sensation of anticipation. There was more to his narrative than he was telling me, and I could sense it rising on the horizon, ready to unveil itself, and I had no idea what was coming. I knew one thing for sure. The days passed, settling into a comfortable routine. Yet, there was an undeniable difference between us. He remained silent, frequently retiring inside himself. But every now and again, there was a lingering gaze, a remark left hanging, or an unasked inquiry. It wasn't something I could describe, but I sensed an undercurrent of anxiety running through each conversation. One evening, I found him standing in the hallway, staring at the old family photos lined up on the wall. The dim light cast long shadows, softening his expression, though his eyes held something I couldn't quite read. He didn't notice me at first, but as I approached, he turned, giving a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Remember when we went to the lake?" he asked, nodding to a snapshot of us from years ago, all tanned and beaming ear to ear, splashing in the water. "Of course," I said, giggling, "that you had this grand plan to capture the biggest fish, confident it would be easy. You caught nothing except the cold," he chuckled gently, a genuine sound that eased the strain for a minute. "Yeah, I suppose some things never change." We fell quiet. Both were immersed in their recollections, yet there was a weird weight in the air, as if he was holding something back. I watched him, hoping that this would be the moment he finally opened up, but he merely nodded at the photo and turned away, returning to his room without saying anything further. That night, sleep was elusive. I lay there, looking at the ceiling, my mind racing with questions. A part of me wanted to confront him, demand answers, and finally comprehend what was going on behind the surface. But every time I contemplated it, I held back, wondering whether I'd only push him away. The next day, I figured a change of pace would be beneficial, so I suggested we go for a drive. He was apprehensive at first, but soon consented, and we found ourselves driving down country roads with the windows down and fresh air filling the vehicle. For the first time in days, he appeared calm, with a trace of a grin on his lips, as we drove in peaceful stillness. As the sun dropped low in the horizon, we pulled over near a calm lake where we had visited 2 years before. It was deserted, with the lake quiet and motionless, reflecting the sky above. We sat on the bonnet of the car, watching the sunset, and it seemed like old times, like we were just two family members enjoying a nice evening together. But just when I thought the tension had been relieved, he turned to me, his look solemn. "Uncle, do you ever feel like there is something more you could have done? Perhaps you overlooked something vital?" The inquiry caught me off guard, but I suspected there was more to it than he was revealing. "Yeah," I responded thoughtfully. "Sometimes we don't know how important things are until later, but life has a strange way of giving us second chances." He nodded slowly, his gaze far away as he looked out at the lake. I do not know. Sometimes I feel trapped, like if no matter what I do, I'm not where I should be." He trailed off, his voice frustrated, as if he was dealing with something beyond his control. Before I could react, he let out a loud sigh and rubbed his hands together, as if to center himself. "Maybe it's ridiculous," he whispered, almost as if he was speaking to himself. "Maybe I should simply let it go." "Hey, this isn't stupid," I said it in a kind tone. "Sometimes things don't make sense immediately away, but that doesn't mean they aren't worth investigating. You do not need to know all the answers right now." He looked at me with a sense of relief in his eyes. "Thanks, Uncle. I suppose I needed to hear that." The journey back was silent, but not in an uncomfortable way. There was an understanding between us, a common recognition of the unsaid weight we both felt. He glanced to me as we pulled into the driveway, smiling slightly. "Thank you for today," he murmured, his voice lower than normal. as I responded, giving his shoulder a small squeeze. "You know I am here for you." He nodded and held my stare for a time before exiting the car and heading inside. I watched him go, feeling an odd combination of relief and dread. I knew we'd taken a step forward, but there was still something left unsaid, a shadow that clung to the edges of our conversation. Over the next few days, things shifted between us. The silences grew shorter, the conversations a bit longer, and I began to see glimpses of the nephew. I remembered the one who was open and easygoing, unburdened by whatever had been weighing him down. We spent more time together sharing stories, cooking meals, even watching a few old movies late into the night. But as much as I enjoyed the newfound closeness, there was a part of me that couldn't ignore the tension simmering just beneath the surface. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there like a storm on the horizon, waiting to break. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I sensed it in the lingering looks, the silent moments when none of us talked, and the air seemed thick with something I couldn't describe. One evening, as we sat on the couch, a pleasant talk evolved into raucous laughing, leaving us both breathless and wiping away tears. But when the laughing died down, he gazed at me, his countenance enigmatic, his gaze concentrated in a manner I had never seen before. "Uncle," he began to speak barely above a whisper, "have you ever felt that you were supposed to be closer to someone, but you cannot?" The question lingered in the air, weighty and heated. I hesitated, wondering how to react. A part of me recognized where he was headed, but I wasn't sure I was prepared to face it. "Well," I responded slowly, selecting my words carefully, "I believe we are pulled to individuals in ways we do not always understand, but this does not imply we should act on it." He nodded, his attention shifting to his hands, but I could see the strain in his stance, the way his shoulders were drawn tight. For a time, I assumed he'd let it go, that we'd move on from the chat and resume our normal routine. But then, he raised his eyes and met mine with an intensity that caught me off guard. "What if it is something you cannot ignore?" he asked, his voice just above a whisper, his words tinged with a vulnerability that went right through me. I took a long breath and felt the weight of his inquiry descend on me. Sometimes it's preferable to take a step back and give ourselves time to process our emotions before acting on them. Things might get difficult if we don't allow ourselves enough time to consider. He leaned in, his face inches from mine, his gaze flashing down to my lips, and I felt my willpower weaken under the weight of the unspoken words between us. Finally breaking, I didn't move or breathe as he bridged the gap, his lips brushing against mine in a delicate, tentative kiss. The world seemed to freeze as his hand traveled from my shoulder to the side of my face, his touch gentle and almost respectful. I didn't pull away or stop him as his lips pushed against mine again, more insistently this time, and I felt a warmth spread through me, a weird sensation of rightness. In the midst of the turmoil, he drew back slightly, his gaze seeking mine as if waiting for me to say anything to prevent him from telling him. This was a mistake, but I couldn't and didn't want to. Instead, I found myself reaching for him, placing my palm on his arm to anchor myself in the present moment. "I'm not sure how this feels," he whispered, as his forehead rested on mine. "It feels like this is how it should be." I didn't know how to reply or articulate the labyrinth of feelings that were churning inside me. All I knew was that for the first time in a long time, everything felt right, even if it didn't make sense. I could feel his fingertips running delicately over my jaw, sending a pleasure through me. And I realized we were on the verge of something we couldn't reverse. He drew in again, his lips catching mine in a delicate yet urgent kiss, tinged with a calm desperation that mirrored the urgency in my emotions. I felt myself dissolving into the moment, the warmth of his touch anchoring me, even as my thoughts raced with the consequences of what we were doing. But I didn't want to ponder about or question it. I allowed myself to become lost in the moment. The peaceful intimacy of the kitchen is the sole witness. His hand slid to my waist, bringing me closer, and I could feel his heartbeat steady and powerful, mimicking mine. For what seemed like an eternity, we remained there, entranced in the peaceful proximity and unspoken words between us. Finally, finding expression in his sweet touch and loving kiss, I knew we'd crossed a boundary and things would never be the same. But in that moment, I didn't care. All that mattered was the sense of his arms around me, the comfort of his presence, and the peaceful assurance that we were precisely where we needed to be. Eventually, he pulled back his gaze, soft yet intense, as he looked at me, his hand still resting on my waist. "Uncle, I don't know what this means, but I don't want it to stop." I swallowed, my mind racing, but I knew he was right. Our bodies had met, wrapped around each other, melting into the emotions that consumed us. We couldn't control ourselves. Everything happened so naturally. In that moment, nothing else mattered. I reached up and rested my hand on his face, feeling the warmth in his flesh. His gaze caught on mine, and I offered him a sweet grin, my heart hammering in rhythm. With his whispering, I gave in. Then, with our mouths inches apart and the air heavy with expectation, we relished his return to intensity. My smile was a combination of relief and something deeper in his eyes, and we stood there, locked in one another's arms. I realized we'd finally found the strength to confront the reality, to acknowledge the emotions we'd both been avoiding. The kitchen remained silent throughout the night, engulfing us in a sense of calm and rightness. And for the first time, I felt as if I was precisely where I should be. The days that followed were weird, with each moment immersed in a peculiar combination of familiarity and novelty that I couldn't escape. We'd settled into an unsaid cadence, a common agreement that remained between us like a secret. Only we knew, but there was an intensity to it, a heaviness that none of us quite understood. Nonetheless, it seemed to draw us closer, each contact tinted with memories of that night in the kitchen. Late one evening, I found myself back in the kitchen, peering out the window at the peaceful street below. The home was quiet except for the gentle hum of the refrigerator, and I assumed I was alone until I heard his footsteps. He entered gently, his presence apparent. However, the sight of him made my heart speed. He caught my stare, and for a long time, neither of us said anything, feeling as if the heavy stillness was superfluous. It was a quiet that contained everything we hadn't spoken, all we'd been avoiding. And tonight, It seemed like the weight of it was just too much to bear. He approached, his demeanor open but guarded. "Uncle," he began to speak just above a whisper. "I don't know how to make sense of this." His glance caught mine, a spark of vulnerability. "He is crossing his face." I took a long breath, letting the weight of his words fall on me. "I don't have all the answers either," I said gently. "But perhaps we don't need to grasp everything right now." He nodded, his demeanor softening as he approached. We stood there, the gap between us closing with each passing second, and I could feel the familiar warmth of his presence, the unsaid link that seemed to bind us together. His hand extended out softly, resting on my arm, providing wordless reassurance. "I just don't want this to vanish," he said. His voice was filled with a calm purpose. "I do not want us to pretend that it did not happen." I caught his look, and the honesty in his eyes reflected mine own. "Neither do I responded, my voice barely above a whisper. The stillness stretched between us, thick with comprehension, and I knew we'd passed a line we'd never get back from. But there was some calm in it, a serene acceptance of the course we'd chosen. He went closer, his hands sliding from my arm to mine, fingers tangling. It was a simple gesture, but it conveyed volumes, a silent commitment that neither of us had to make. We stood there, our hands clasped, a sense of calm settling over us. As the night stretched on, as the days turned into weeks, we navigated the delicate balance between familiarity and the uncharted territory we found ourselves in. We shared quiet conversations over coffee, stolen glances across the room, each moment filled with a tension that was both thrilling and terrifying. There were moments when doubt crept in, whispers of uncertainty that lingered at the edges of my mind. But every time I found reassurance in his presence, in the quiet strength of his support. One evening, as we sat in the living room, he looked at me, his gaze thoughtful. "Uncle, do you ever wonder where this is all going?" The question caught me off guard, and I found myself pausing, searching for the right words. "I think sometimes it's okay to not have all the answers," I replied slowly. "Sometimes it's enough just to be in the moment." He nodded, his expression contemplative, as if he was processing my words. "I guess I just don't want to lose this." I reached out, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We're in this together," I said quietly. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." He gave a small, relieved smile, and for a moment, the weight of his worries seemed to lift. We sat there in comfortable silence, the quiet companionship owing to the uncertainties that lingered between us. The future felt vast and unknown, but in that moment, it didn't matter. We had each other, and that was enough. The weeks that followed were a haze, with one day melting into the next as we navigated the complexity of our newfound bond. There were moments of doubt and reluctance, but we always found our way back to each other, with a common resolution that carried us through the quiet moments in the kitchen, the shared looks across the room, and the late-night whispered chats. Each one was a thread that connected us, creating a tapestry of understanding and trust that grew stronger with each passing day. But there were times when the truth of our predicament pushed down on us, almost too much to bear. We lived in the shadows, our connection, a secret known only to us. And although it drew us closer together, it also created a gap, that neither of us could cross. Some evenings, I lie awake, wondering whether we were doomed to live in the shadows forever, despite our concerns and worries. There was a quiet strength in our link, a resilience that saw us through the worst times. We found peace in one another, a haven from the world which couldn't comprehend the depth of our bond. And in that heaven, we discovered a component that neither of us had known before. One evening, as we sat in the kitchen, a peaceful understanding fell over us. The future was unknown, and the route ahead was fraught with obstacles. But in that moment, we knew we were precisely where we needed to be. We didn't need the world's approval or anybody else's understanding, because we knew one another, and that understanding gave us power to get through. He reached out and took my hand in his, and for a little time, the world faded away, leaving only the peaceful comfort of our shared connection. We sat there, silent, our hands joined in a wordless agreement that whatever happened next, we'd face it together. And in that pledge, we discovered something deeper than words, a peaceful confidence that no matter what the future brought, we would be okay. As we sat there, the overhead light cast a warm glow across the kitchen. I felt a sensation of serenity come over me. The voyage ahead was unpredictable, and the path was fraught with obstacles. But at that moment, I felt we had something unshakable, a relationship that would see us through. And as the night went on, we sat in quiet, our hands clasped, a quiet promise that no matter what came next, we would face it together. In the stillness of that night, I found a peace that I had never known before, and in that peace, I found the strength to embrace the future, to face the challenges that lay ahead, knowing that we had each other. And as the night turned to dawn, I knew that no matter what happened next, we would face it together, our relationship strong, our connection, a peaceful assurance that whatever the future brought, we would be okay. Our narrative had been a voyage of discovery, leading us to a point of understanding and trust that went beyond words. And while we sat in the silent kitchen, our hands intertwined, I felt we'd found something that would help us form a lifelong friendship.